The lesson topic for this video is solving quadratics using the quadratic formula. Alright, so before we begin, just so you know, you do not have to copy this down. I just want to talk through it a little bit. So it says find x when y equals 3. We have done this. We are solving, in this case, as you can see down below, by factoring. So if I go ahead and take this 3 and I put it in for the y value, okay, now we have 3 equals x squared minus 5x minus 3. We realize since we have an x squared term and an x term, we need to solve this by factoring if possible, which means we need to get this 3 out of here so we have a 0. So we subtract 3 from this side and we subtract 3 from this side. These cancel out, we get 0, and we get x squared minus 5x minus 6. Now we realize that this can be easily factored into two sets of parentheses because the leading coefficient is 1. Our negative 6 has a couple different factor pairs that we could use, and we realize that positive 1 and negative 6 are what are going to multiply to give me negative 6 and add to give me negative 5. So we have factored this correctly, and then we use the zero product property, the ZPP, in order to factor to solve, or continue to solve, I should say. So we write x plus 1 equals 0 and x minus 6 equals 0. And if we subtract 1 from both sides of this, we get x equals negative 1. And if we add 6 to both sides of this equation, we get x equals 6. So we've done this solving quadratics by factoring. Now, what happens when we see something like this? All right, so the same directions apply. These directions are still what we are using right here. Find x when y equals 3. So I put that 3 in right here, and then I need to subtract that from both sides, like so. And these cancel to give me 0. 0 equals x squared plus 3x, and then this gives me 7. Well, if I put 7 over here in this box and I talk about its factors, 1 and 7, I know 1 and 7 adds up to 8, and there's no way for me to get the 3 right there to factor this. So if there's no way for us to factor, well, we need a new method for solving quadratic equations. That is where the quadratic formula comes into play. Perhaps you remember the quadratic formula, but either way, I will show it on the next slide. So the quadratic formula is, as shown right here, super important to put in your notes, of course, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and the whole thing is divided by 2a. Now, our job is, of course, to put a value in for b, a value in for a, and a value in for c, and then simplify this to find out what x equals. All right, those values come from our quadratic equation, and this is in standard form. Anytime you see an x squared term and an x term written in this kind of way, this is in standard form. Okay? Just like with previous lessons on solving by factoring, we do need to make sure that the equation is equal to 0 before we use the quadratic formula. Okay? So make sure you do that. And the second thing is you also probably want to make sure to take out a GCF, factor out a GCF if there is one, like typical. Then if you look and see that the quadratic does not factor, so again we use factoring if possible, does it factor? And if it doesn't, then we use the quadratic formula. All right? So in this example right here, we have a quadratic equation in standard form, and just so you know, I'm solving this when y equals 0, so we put a 0 in. Now again, if y equals 5 was the case, we'd put a 5 in here, and then before we write down what a, b, and c are, we'd have to subtract the 5 from both sides. Okay, but this is already set equal to 0. So that means our a value is 2, right? Our b value, be careful here, is negative 4, and our c value is 1. Again, we just get those from where they are located in the standard form of the equation. And now we just go through and we fill in what we need to in the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b. Now b is negative 4. This is one of the places that people make mistakes. We'll get back to that in a second. Plus or minus the square root of, again, that b value is negative 4. It is going to be important that we put this in parentheses. I'll talk about that again in a second as well. squared minus 4 times the a value, which is 2, times the c value, which is 1. Make sure that square root goes all the way across. And then all divided by, notice the entire numerator is divided by 2 times the a value, which is 2. All right, so again, I just wrote this with my b values in here, -4, my a value in here, and my c value here. Now we need to simplify. There are probably 4 main places you have to be very careful. First of all, this negative, negative. Well, what's a negative, negative? That becomes a positive. So when b is already negative, it ends up going in as a positive. And if b is positive, then it will be negative out in front. Plus or minus. This is the next place. We have to be really careful if we're using our calculator or just multiplying even in our head. Remember that -4 squared, a negative times a negative, will always be positive. So this b squared part right here will always end up being positive because we're squaring the b value. Right here we have to be careful as well, especially if the 2 or the 1 were negative. In this case they're not, so it's not as tricky, but if one of these was negative or both of them, that's where people make some big mistakes as well. The last mistake comes way at the end of the problem, we'll get to it in a second, is when we're simplifying at the very end. So let's go ahead and move forward. X equals -4. Well, -4 makes it a +4, plus or minus the square root of -4 squared is +16. +16 minus 4 times 2 times 1. 4 times 2 is 8, times 1 is still 8, so -8. And the whole thing is divided by 2 times 2, which is 4. Alright, so now we still need to simplify everything in the numerator before we divide by 4. So keep that in mind. Alright, over here, we're going to say x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 8, which is 8, divided by 4. Now we're going to simplify our square root, so 4 plus or minus 2.828. Now again, if that was a negative under the square root, we would deal with I, and we'll talk about that in a later example, divided by 4. Now right here is the next place that people make mistakes. Make sure you continue to simplify the numerator before dividing by 4. So we've got 2 options again, just like in our previous work with a plus or minus. We have 4 plus 2.828 divided by 4, or we have x equals 4 minus 2.828 because of the plus or minus divided by 4. Make sure on your calculator that this is super important, once you type this in, and make sure you hit enter before you divide by 4. If you type 4 plus 2.828 divided by 4 all in one line, the math will end up being done incorrectly for what we need because it will divide before it adds because it'll follow the order of operations. So 4 plus 2.828 enter divided by 4. You should get 1.707. Check that on your calculator. And then 4 minus 2.828 divided by 4 after you hit enter is 0.293. Double check those because that is a place that people make mistakes. Okay, so we're going to do another example, and I'm going to ask that you for sure continue watching this video lesson because something a little different happens. Alright, so once again we have our a value, it's -2, it's the value in front of x squared. We have our b value right here, which is 4, and we have our c value of -5. Alright, so we're going to start using our quadratic formula. X equals -b, the b value is 4, so -4, plus or minus the square root of the b value, which is 4, squared, minus 4 times the a value, which is -2, times the c value, which is -5. All divided by 2 times, 2 times the a value, which is -2. All right, So next thing we're going to do, simplify a little bit. X equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of. Now slowly simplify here. 4 squared is 16. But now what happens here is that we've got all these negatives. So you got to be really careful here. We have a negative 4 times a negative 2 times a negative 5. So really what you can think about is that this is a negative times a negative times a negative. Well, a negative times a negative is positive, and then times another negative will end up being negative. So it's going to be minus. Now we can just look at the numbers. 4 times 2 is 8, times 5 is 40. All divided by 2 times negative 2, which is negative 4. Okay, just to make sure you understand, we cannot cancel these out right now. That will never happen. You just keep simplifying in the numerator, and then we'll divide by negative 4 at the end. So now we have x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 40. Well, that's going to be negative 24 all over negative 4. And maybe you notice right now what is a little different in this problem than the previous. We have a negative under the square root. Do you remember what we use when we have a negative under the square root? Well, we use I. Remember that I is equal to the square root of a negative 1. So when I simplify this next, I'm going to write x equals negative 4. And by the way, remember I said in a previous lesson as well, once you get a negative under the square root, we're not going to use our calculators anymore. So you can flip that upside down. We're not going to use it. Okay? So negative 4 plus or minus, well, the square root of negative 24. I'm going to bring that negative 1, square root of negative 1 out front as an I. And then we can leave the square root of 24. And it's all divided by negative 4. And guess what? You're done. There is nothing else you can simplify here. We could find the square root of 24, but there's really no need. All that would do is give us a number in front of I, and then in a lot of cases people think we can continue simplifying because of that. We cannot combine these. They are not like terms because this is an imaginary term and this is a real term. And therefore we also cannot divide by negative 4. This is our final answer when we have a negative under the square root.